everyone, we're looking at chapter 4 this week, some ethical guidelines for psychological research. What are some historical examples where maybe ethical guidelines weren't present or were violated? What are some of the core ethical principles for psychologists and for conducting research? And then kind of talking about how this is a very thoughtful balance and kind of a fine line that we have to walk between wanting to get answers and also wanting to make sure that we are protecting the rights of participants. So the idea for this chapter is that people who participate in research should be protected, right? We should make sure that no harm is coming to them, that they know what they're getting themselves into. But at the same time, we have to recognize that sometimes a little bit of deception or maybe not sharing everything with our participants is also important for getting some of the answers that we want. So again, a little bit of a thoughtful balance and a fine line to try and figure out. So one of the most famous kind of examples of this, and there's a few of these that are talked about in the textbook, so obviously make sure that you're reading through the chapter in a little more detail, but the Tuskegee syphilis study that happened back in the 1930s, or I should say started in the 1930s. At that time, we were seeing increased rates of syphilis in the United States. And so in 1932, the US Public Health branch collaborated with the Tuskegee Institute to conduct a study. They recruited 600 poor Black American men. At the time in the 1930s, they used the term for their study was 600 dark-skinned male participants, but it was mainly poor Black Americans who were recruited for this experiment. And 400 of them were infected with syphilis and 200 of them were uninfected. And so what they did is they wanted to know what are the effects, what are the long-term effects of untreated syphilis? But they misled the participants to think that they were going to be receiving free healthcare and treatment for the syphilis that they had. And this went on for almost 40 years. It was a very long-term study looking at those long-term effects. The men who were in the study were not treated respectfully. They weren't treated at all with respect. They were lied to. Information was withheld. They were harmed and subjected to painful tests. They weren't treated, so their syphilis was allowed to continue unchecked. And they were targeted as a disadvantaged social group. Syphilis can affect anyone, but instead of studying all individuals, they only use these poor Black men who are targeted for the experiment. So there were a lot of unethical choices that were made in this study. It's a very commonly referenced example of not protecting the rights of participants. These men that were involved in this study weren't treated respectfully. They were harmed. They were targeted specifically as a disadvantaged group. You know, all things that are really frowned upon in research now that we have our APA guidelines in place as a result of some of these early experiments. Another one that's often referenced is Stanley Milgram's obedience studies. And his, I think, illustrate a very difficult ethical balance, which I mentioned already, that there are a lot of ethical questions that come up about balancing risk to participants with the benefit to society. Now, obedience was something that was studied very heavily during World War II. Why is it that people obey? Why do people do what they're told, especially by an authority figure? And Milgram sought to look into that a little bit with a very famous experiment where he had a learner and a teacher. And the idea was that the teacher would present a list of words to the learner, and then they would test their memory for these words and deliver an electrical shock to them whenever they got one of them wrong. Now, there was a big machine in the room with different shock levels on it, and the participants were instructed to give an electric shock by flipping a switch to the person in the other room. Now, they couldn't see the other person, and that other person was actually an actor. There weren't any electrical shocks actually being given, but the teachers didn't know that and oftentimes would experience great distress at hearing the actor in the other room be upset or uncomfortable or in pain. But despite the distress, 2/3 of participants continued to give all the way up to what would have been fatal levels of electric shock simply because they were told to do so. And so they were trying to understand, why is it that people would obey? What is it about the circumstance that makes people do things they don't want to do simply because they were told to do so by an authority figure? And after the experiment was over, they had to do something called debriefing. They had to let the participants know that they didn't actually give any electric shocks. They're letting them know the true nature of the experiment. But if they had told them that information in the beginning, it would have completely altered the results. And this is where that fine balance comes in. If you really wanted to get the answers, you can't reveal all the information. You have to keep a little bit hidden. But in keeping some of that information hidden, a lot of the participants cried, they were upset, they experienced a lot of distress because they thought that they were harming another person and that they had to do so as part of the experiment. So this is another very commonly referenced study. There are more, and I talked about a few more in the lecture on Canvas this week, but all of these different experiments and studies that came up led to the need for some core ethical principles. It was going to be really important that there are some guidelines for the protection of human subjects in research. And so as a way of creating those, we started with something called the Belmont Report, some principles and applications to make sure that people were treated respectfully and that they were protected for engaging in research, that they wouldn't walk out of it being harmed or damaged in some way. And it had some really core principles that we need to respect people who are taking part in research, that we need to have informed consent, meaning they are informed of what they're getting into. We let them know any risks or harms that might come, and they can decide whether or not they want to take part in the research. We don't have to tell them everything, but we tell them enough that they know and are informed about what they're getting into. A few other things, the principle of beneficence and the principle of justice. There were a lot of core principles that came out of this report. And then the APA added a little bit more. And I have this chart here that goes into them a little bit better. We sometimes call this Belmont +2, the APA's 5 general principles for people who are participating in research. So beneficence means that we treat people in ways that will benefit them. We don't want to cause them any kind of suffering. We want to conduct research that will benefit society and benefit the people who are participating, and the knowledge that we gain from it will help others. We want to have fidelity and responsibility, establish relationships of trust, accepting responsibility for our professional behavior. Integrity being another core principle, one of those +2 from the APA. Striving to be accurate, truthful, and honest as much as possible. Again, sometimes we have to deceive a little bit and debrief later, but in our role as a researcher or a teacher or practitioner, to have that integrity and accuracy, truthfulness, honesty, and transparency whenever possible. Justice, striving to treat all groups of people fairly. This was a big thing that was violated in that syphilis study of really targeting a disadvantaged group. So we want to have sample research participants from the same population that will benefit from the research. Beware of our biases, trying to capture good samples, random samples of people, and to treat the participants fairly. We also want to have respect for people's rights and dignity. Recognize that people are autonomous agents, protecting their rights, including the right to privacy, their right to give consent, that informed consent we talked about, for the treatment or research that they're getting involved in, and the right to have participation treated with confidentiality. We're not going to share your information with other people. We will keep it private or very general so that you could never know what came from each participant. And understanding that some populations may be less able to give autonomous consent and take precautions against coercing those people. So trying to, again, make sure that your rights are not ever being violated, you're not being harmed, you know what you're getting into, and you're able to give your consent. Now, these are things that have been around since like the late 1970s. They are taken very seriously. You can get into a lot of trouble for violating these rights in research, including fines, being kind of shamed or shunned in the academic community, and then or banned from researching in journals. And in extreme cases, you could even face criminal charges. There are rights for animals as well. They aren't nearly as strict, but there are a lot of rights to protect the laboratory animals that are being used as part of research. Animal care guidelines follow what we call the 3 Rs: replacement, refinement, and reduction, right? So I'm trying very hard to make sure that animals' rights are protected as well, that we're not doing anything unnecessarily cruel or subjecting animals to any kind of unnecessarily harsh or painful procedures. It's definitely mixed attitudes of scientists and students toward animal research. A lot of animal rights groups stepping in to protect the rights of animals, not as strict, right? They're definitely not as strict of regulations. We have to try and ethically balance animal welfare and rights and research. Oftentimes we do animal trials before we do human trials. So there are some protections here, but definitely not nearly as strict as we see with people. So again, this needs to be a very thoughtful balance when we're making some of these ethical decisions. A balance of priorities. We need to weigh the potential harm to our human or animal participants against what the knowledge gained from the research will contribute to society. And this is something that is often evaluated by a review board, an internal review board or a committee will get together and look at the experiment to be done and look at all of these different elements. Are there ethical guidelines and concerns that we need to worry about? Is the benefit, does it outweigh the potential harm or potential consequences? And these are a case-by-case basis, but these protective measures, these ethical guidelines are there for a reason. And there's a lot of awful experiments that were done before people had to hold to these guidelines. So it's a very thoughtful balance of trying to make sure that we get the information we need, but also protect the rights of people participating in research. So that is it for chapter 4. That's our last chapter that we're covering from our textbook. Make sure that you get going on all the other required weekly materials and get everything done before the posted deadline for the week.